Thank you.
Good afternoon. We're also students from WPI, and over the past 7 weeks, we've completed a project in collaboration with the Hope Exchange evaluating the impacts of the Cape Town Street People policy. I'm Elena Radin, and I am a biomedical engineering major.
I'm Thomas Delacroce, and I study industrial engineering.
I'm Cassandra Lira, and I study aerospace engineering.
I'm Connor Huftelin, and I'm a physics major. Our sponsor, the Hope Exchange, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the homeless. Sorry.
Yep.
Our sponsor, the Hope Exchange, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the homeless through providing dignity and opportunities for change. They provide a wide variety of services daily.
Some of the services that the Hope Exchange provides include daily ablutions, porridge twice a week, clothing, and access to a social worker.
Our project was centered on the Street People policy, which the city implemented in 2013. It outlines the accommodation process for street people, and it starts when a DSD, or Department of Social Development field worker, comes in contact with a street person on the street. They then analyze the street person's needs and match them with an NGO for accommodation. Once they finish their accommodation and reintegrate back into society, they can access their local network of care, or LNOC, for any service they may need afterwards. The policy has a provision where it asks for it to be reviewed every 2 years or as necessary, and as of last month, is undergoing its first official review.
So with that, we also analyzed 2 specific bylaws, the Waste Management Bylaw and the Public Nuisance and Spaces Bylaw. These bylaws are prohibit sleeping on the street, building shelters, and leaving belongings on the street. And if people are found to be breaking these rules, they can be arrested, have their belongings taken, or fined. These bylaws effectively criminalize homelessness.
While in Cape Town, our goal was to work alongside the Hope Exchange in order to find solutions to the current homelessness crisis through an in-depth assessment of the Street People policy.
In order to achieve our goal, we had 4 objectives. The first objective was to determine how the policy was developed. Our next objective was to evaluate the policy's impact on stakeholders. Our third objective was to identify any complications in the policy. And our last objective was to create a video to advocate for the Hope Exchange.
So to accomplish our first objective, discover why the policy was originally developed, we interviewed several city officials, starting with the author of the policy, Ms. Cornelia Finch, and then we also interviewed city councilor Zahid Badruddin, as well as program manager for all local groups, Ms. Lorraine Frost.
In addition to this, we also interviewed NGOs, including the Hope Exchange, Stroutvik, and the Haven Night Shelters. We also got a chance to speak with other NGOs at the Street People Dialogue, hosted by the City of Cape Town, as well as the Street People Forum.
In order to better understand the bylaws and the current court case surrounding them, we met with the lawyers representing both sides. Mr. Lewin, representing the Street People, and Mr. Trattler, representing the Ratepayers Association.
And then in order to understand how the policy impacts the street people themselves, we interviewed the street people. And these are our findings.
So the first finding we had was the greatest need for street people, and through our interviews we found that access to affordable housing and consistent employment are their top 2 needs.
So regarding housing, we looked at reasons why street people were not going to shelters or any problems that they had. And we found that many of the shelters were too expensive for street people, so they would prefer to live on the streets. We also found that there are a lack of LGBTQ plus specific housing, and many members of that community feel unsafe in shelters that are not specifically for them. And we also found that many of the street people feel that life in the shelters is too restrictive and the schedules are too confining for them.
In regards to employment, the Extended Public Works Program, or EPWP, has a term limit of 3 months, which is partially precluded by the labor laws. And in order to have people reintegrate, they need to have a steady flow of income, and 3 months of work with a 2-week mandatory off period doesn't necessarily provide that for street people. We also looked into licensing laws for people, and it's really difficult for people living on the street to obtain one of these licenses to sell their crafts because they do not have a permanent address.
We also found, with regards to housing, that many of the shelters were full, and many street people have been on the waiting list for a long time, or the shelters were very far away from the center of Cape Town.
So our second finding was the protocol for police engagement when coming in contact with a street person, and we learned about this through our interviews with the city officials. So it starts with a complaint being filed about a street person, then a DSD field worker will be sent out to offer accommodation services. If they refuse the accommodation services, a peace officer, who's a law enforcement official who is trained to come in contact with street people, is sent out to offer a compliance notice. Again, if they refuse, then law enforcement is sent out to either find the person or arrest them.
This policy for engaging with street people, however, is neither written nor referenced in the street people policy. During our interviews with street people, we discovered that this protocol is rarely, if ever, followed. Many of the street people we talked to who have had interactions with law enforcement were not previously approached by a field worker or a peace officer, had not been given a compliance notice, and were simply told to either move, had their belongings confiscated, or were threatened to be arrested.
While interviewing NGOs and city officials, we found that both reintegration and rehabilitation are key aspects for resolving homelessness. Reintegration involves reunifying a person into the community, either with their family or through work, and rehabilitation involves resolving issues such as mental illness or drug addiction. While there was common consensus that both are necessary, there was disagreement on which should be prioritized. So some NGOs thought that reintegration should be prioritized because that gives a street person a support network, while other NGOs thought that rehabilitation should be prioritized because without solving those immediate issues like mental illness, a street person will fall back into homelessness.
So our final finding was that both the city and the NGO sector want increased collaboration with each other. So currently, the city holds street people dialogue semi-regularly where they invite NGOs and street people themselves to have their voices heard. Also, on the Home Act Committee, which is the city's homeless agency, there are two representatives slotted to NGOs.
From the perspective of the NGOs, many feel that two representatives does not effectively encompass all of the voices of the NGOs and street people, and they feel left out of the street people dialogues because they're not consulted on the agenda and it's solely a city written agenda. These are our recommendations.
So to increase collaboration between the city and the NGOs, we recommend regular meetings between the DSD field workers and the NGO social workers, because these are the people that really know street people. They're on the ground every single day working with them. Also, if the street people dialogues are going to continue, they need to have an independent facilitator who consults both the NGOs and the city before the dialogue takes place, so both voices are heard on the agenda.
The Street People's Forum have also discussed starting their own dialogues on a smaller scale. This would be helpful because the Street People Forum is made up of several different NGOs that all represent different groups of homeless people who all have varied and important needs that need to be addressed.
So one of the most current things going on in the news right now is the revisitation of the bylaws, questioning the constitutionality of them because they effectively criminalize homelessness. We're hoping that through this constitutional review, they take a chance to revisit the bylaws and potentially make some exceptions for street people in them. We would suggest that there is a clause written in for the, similar to the Colorado Right to Rest Act, which would allow street people to sleep on the street undisturbed for certain hours of the night. So it takes the stress off of street people as well as the law enforcement